All right, everyone. Hello. Uh, this is a little chat about word choice, which we are focusing on for our second checkpoint here. If some of you have been in class, then you know we've been talking about poems and annotating poems, specifically looking for different poetic devices, different ways that those poetic devices help the structure of the poem and help add meaning and help us pull out the themes of that poem. So we're going to kind of look at the same thing, except now we're going to focus more on the words that authors or poets use to help create those meanings. And then eventually we'll put all this together to help write or pick out our own poem that we can pull a message out that we can apply to our own community and why we would want that poem displayed there. And a lot of the ways we get those messages and understand what those themes are is through the word choice. So that's what we're going to talk about today. As you can see, word choice is a cognitive skill that involves looking closely at the meaning of the words, right? So when we talk about the meaning of the words, we got three different types. We get the denotative meaning, the connotative meaning, and the figurative meaning, right? So one word could have three different meanings attached to it. I'm going to explain what those are. Our denotative meaning is the written down dictionary definition of the word. For example, the word curious and the word nosy both have the denotative meaning eager to know or learn something. A quick tip or trick to remember what a denotative meaning is it sounds like denote in part of the word. Denotative, denote, and when you denote something, you write it down. So the denotative meaning is the written down meaning of the word, what you would find in the dictionary. Now, what we're going to move on to next is the connotative meaning. So keep in mind these two words, curious and nosy, they both have the same dictionary definition. As far as the dictionary is concerned, they both mean the same thing. But when we hear each of them, we might think about different things. And that is what the connotative meaning is. Connotative meaning is an emotional or cultural association that we give to the word. Connotative meanings can be positive or negative. The word curious has a positive connotative meaning. We associate it with people who are passionate and thoughtful. Okay? The word nosy, on the other hand, has a negative connotative meaning. We associate it with people who get overly involved in other people's lives. Okay. Also think about, if I use the words hungry and starving, right? Dictionary wise, they both have to do with not having enough food, right? Wanting food. But if somebody says, oh, I'm a little hungry, it could mean maybe I just haven't eaten a little bit. If somebody says, oh, I'm starving, then they must be really hungry. Maybe they haven't eaten in weeks or months or anything. There's more of an urgent, connotation associated with those words. So the thoughts and emotion or association we give to a word, that's the connotative meaning. And usually it's positive or negative. If somebody calls you curious, it might almost be like a compliment. If somebody calls you nosy, you might get upset because that has a negative connotation attached to it. So that's our connotative meaning. So far, we've said denotative meaning is the written down definition in the dictionary. Two words could have the same or similar denotative meaning. Connotative meaning or connotation is the emotional or cultural association attached to that word that you think of when you hear it. And that's where those two words who mean the same thing could make us feel something different based on their connotation. And the last meaning we have is our figurative meaning. So you've heard figurative language before. We've talked about it a little bit with the last checkpoint. Figurative meaning is the meaning the words are meant to represent or suggest when they are not used literally. For example, the figurative meaning of it's raining cats and dogs is that it is raining extremely hard, right? So when we say it's raining cats and dogs, we don't literally mean there's cats and dogs falling from the sky. We mean that it's raining extremely hard. Or if I say this bag weighs 1,000 pounds, it doesn't literally weigh 1,000 pounds. We wouldn't be able to lift it. I'm trying to convey that it's super heavy. So our figurative meaning is when we have words that mean something other than what they literally are saying. So figurative, it puts a figure or puts a picture in our head. So when I say it's raining cats and dogs, I'm able to picture in my brain, oh, it must be raining really heavy. But I know that we don't mean there's cats and dogs falling from the sky, okay? The same thing say, oh, I slept like a rock. That's not true. That's not literally true because you didn't sleep like a rock, but that means, oh, you slept very soundly, you were in a deep sleep. Okay, same thing. That's our figurative meaning, right? So a word can have one or all of those three meanings attached to it. So here's some practice with this, all right? We have a couple of words here, right? Let's look at two specific ones, youthful and ham, right? The denotative meaning of youthful is young or seeming young. The connotative meaning is positive and refers to somebody who is full of life, right? The flip side would be childish, okay? If I called you youthful, again, that'd be almost like a compliment. Oh, you're youthful, you have a lot of energy, you seem young. If I called you childish, even though that also has to do, that also means, seeming like, that you're in a child age or you're young, all right? If I called you childish, on the other hand, it might imply that you're immature, or you might associate, somebody who, whines when they don't get their way or anything. It's a bit of a negative connotation. If somebody called you youthful, you'd be, oh, thank you. If somebody calls you childish, you might get upset because one has a positive connotation, one has a negative connotation. And if we look at ham, the other example, right, the denotative meaning is a meat from the upper part of a pig's leg that is salted or dried. So literally, that's what ham means, right? But the figurative meaning is someone who likes to goof around or tell silly jokes. If I said, oh, this guy's a ham, I don't really mean he's meat from a pig. I mean he's a little bit silly. He likes to joke around. So that would be our figurative meaning. And the connotative meaning would be neutral when referring to the meat, but slightly negative when used literally. Okay, so what that means is that if we're using ham in the literal sense, like, oh, it's the meat from a pig's leg, there's really no positive or negative connotation there. We're just telling you what it is. But when I say, oh, this guy's a ham, maybe that's a little bit of a negative connotation because we're saying, oh, he gets a little, he jokes around maybe a little too much. All right. So all three of these meanings can have an impact or effect on the reader. Once we determine the meanings of a word, what is its denotative meaning, what is its connotative meaning, we got to figure out what is its impact or effect, right? The impact or effect is the consequence the word has. How does it make the reader feel, right? These words can create a feeling like fear or anger. They can contribute to, excuse me, the overall theme of the poem. They can add suspense, humor, tension, and they can add to the tone of the text. When we talk about, excuse me, they add to the meaning of the text. We refer to any important idea that is beneath the surface and not directly stated. So a poem could say one thing, but it can mean a couple different things beyond that. If any of you remember from our first checkpoint, we looked at that poem about the sun slappers and the harmony hushers, and then at the end it kind of had that line where it said, live not for the end of the song, live in thee along. That was our metaphor, right? So it meant something, a little bit deeper than what it was actually saying. It was talking about a song, but really that song was a metaphor for life. And don't focus on the end of your life, stay in the moment. That's what we talk about when we say it could affect the meaning of a text. Different themes, different symbolism, character traits, motivations, or the author's purpose, right? All of those things. So to recap so far, right, we have three different meanings for a word: denotative, connotative, and figurative. One means the dictionary definition, denotative. One means the cultural emotion or association we give to that word. That would be the connotative. And then one means, what that word or phrase is trying to represent, not what it literally is saying. That would be the figurative meaning, right? And we know all three of those meanings can have an impact or effect on the reader. They can impact the meaning of a text, which is, kind of what lies beneath the actual words themselves, the themes, the symbolism, right? And they could also have an impact on the tone of the text. That's what we're going to talk about now with this example. So this is a short blurb from The New Colossus by M. Lazarus, which is the poem that's on the base of the Statue of Liberty. So it's a poem written kind of to immigrants, so that when immigrants were coming to America and they would see the Statue of Liberty, they would read this poem, right? And part of the poem says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." So send them to me. The me is referring to the Statue of Liberty or to America. So this poem is calling out to immigrants saying, hey, come, you're welcome here. All right. And notice we have a couple of these words in bold. Those are the words we're going to look at to figure out how these word choices impact the meaning or the tone of the text based on their different denotations and connotations and figurative meanings. Right. So if we look at two of these words, poor and yearning, right? The word poor has a deeply negative connotation and can mean impoverished or lowly pitiful. Okay? So even though the denotative meaning, the dictionary definition, could just have to do with, you don't have a lot of money, the connotative meaning is negative in that, it can mean you're impoverished, you're pitiful, like it says here. And that's what we think of when we hear it. So the use of the word here emphasizes the message of welcome the Statue of Liberty represents. She invites all people in, rich, poor, tired, hungry, okay, regardless of how desperate they are. So that's why Emma Lazarus uses that word. And the next word we have here is yearning, okay? The word yearning has a denotation of not just longing, but extreme longing. It is beyond craving or wanting something. So dictionary-wise, yearning means you're extremely longing for something. You really, really want it. It has a connotation of despair and deep sadness. So its connotation, again, is a little bit negative, and that if you're yearning for something, you might be sad, you might be desperate, you really, really want this thing. Okay? The word allows readers to empathize with immigrants who are coming into this country and need help. Right? One trick to kind of think about word choice is, how would the poem seem if the author had used another word instead? So if she hadn't used yearning and just said, if we go back to the example, your huddled mass is wanting to breathe free. If we didn't have yearning and it said wanting instead, would that have the same effect on us? Your huddled mass is wanting to breathe free. Okay, they want to breathe free. That's probably something they'd like to have. They want it. Versus your huddled mass is yearning to be free. Oh, wow, they must really want to be free. They must be really desperate. That's why they want to come here and start a new life. So think about, the different word. Each word has a different impact on the reader. And if we want more of an impact, we want to use a word that has maybe more of a negative connotation and maybe a dictionary definition that means a little bit more than I just want something. So that's how word choice plays in here. That's a good way to think about it. If you're having trouble is, okay, if the author would have used a different word, would it have had the same impact on me as a reader? And the other way the word choice can affect a poem is it can affect the tone of the poem. So we've looked at how it affects the meaning of the poem, and now it can affect the tone of the poem, which is the attitude expressed by the narrator or the author. I like to think of tone as, if this poem were to come to life and be a person, how would that person seem? What would their attitude be? Would they be admiring? Would they be amused? Would they be happy? Would they be playful? Would it be urgent? Would it be hopeful? It's the attitude that you feel when you read the poem expressed by the author. If any of you have read or heard of Edgar Allan Poe's poetry, a lot of the tones in his poems are dreary, sad, scary, fearful, because he wrote about a lot of those things. And the words he used in his poems kind of gave us that dark, ominous tone. And so here's a little bit more practice with this same poem about how to figure out the impact on the tone. So we have the same blurb here. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless tempest toast to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So there's a lot of text here. Basically, all this is saying is the poem has a combination of negative and positive words. Okay, give me, you're tired, you're poor, your huddle mass is yearning to breathe free. So this first part, a lot of negative connotations there. We're seeing how desperate, how in despair these immigrants really are coming to America, right? First set, a negative, somewhat extreme words are used, like poor and yearning, okay? But in the second half, the words used to describe the statue herself suggest lightness and joy. That's why down here we have send these, the homeless tempest toast to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. So I'm lifting this torch, my lamp. I'm lifting this torch up to show you the way. So, because when you come here, you'll have a better life. You won't be as tired. You won't be as poor. So in the first part of this blurb here, our tone is probably what, a little bit sad, a little bit desperate, okay? But then in the second part, we have a hopeful tone, right? The words suggest a hopeful tone because of the new opportunities and a fresh start that America at this time would represent. And at this time is key because that has to do with the context. This is the last part of word choice that's important when we figure out how, why does the poet use these specific words, right? So we consider context and we consider medium. Context refers to the setting or situation in which a text is written. If you've had Mr. Rogers, then he's probably told you to contextualize things before. And that just means tell me what was going on in history at the time that this poem was written, what events were taking place at the time this was written. That's how we get our context. For this poem that we're looking at specifically, the New Colossus, that was happening at the turn of the century when a lot of immigrants were coming to America. So something written in New York City in 2018 will obviously be a lot different than something written in Great Britain in 1920. So that's why, a lot of you may have been thinking, as I was saying, this was a sign of hope for immigrants to come to America. And you might be thinking now a lot of immigrants are struggling to come to America because they get kicked back to their countries or there's issues at the border. But so if we wrote this poem now in 2020, it would be a lot different because the context of history is a lot different. But, at the time this poem was written in the late 1800s, early 1900s, America was kind of the opposite. A lot of immigrants were struggling in their home countries and they wanted to come to, the shores of America where they could be a little bit more free to practice their religion and find a job and start a new life. So that's why the context comes into play, right? To understand the context of something, we often have to do a little research. Once we know a lot about the time and place when something and where something is written, we can identify how words relate to that time and place, right? So that's our context. Our medium refers to the format used to communicate something. Was it written in a newspaper, for a blog? Was it a short story or a poem? Was it delivered as a speech or recorded as a podcast? The medium influences the types of words that will be used. For example, words in newspapers are often more formal and objective, unbiased, not based on emotions, than words delivered in the speech. Or also think about, if you are looking at something, if you're looking at the news on your phone and it's coming from Instagram or Twitter or somebody's YouTube page, they're going to be very biased because they have an opinion one way or the other. But if you're looking at just a report from your local news, or certain publications that are very down the middle, then they might use words that aren't as biased one way or the other. Right? So to sum it up, here's what we think about when we think about word choice. Whenever we're trying to analyze word choice in a poem, we need to do these things. First, we need to find the words in the text that have the biggest impact or effect in its meaning. So as I read this poem, what words have the biggest impact on me? What words make me feel a certain way the most? What words create the best picture in my head? Once we find those words, we got to figure out what are their denotative meanings, what's their dictionary definition, what's the connotative meaning, what's the feeling that's, that we associate with that word or emotion we associate with that word. And then What are their figurative meanings, if there are any? Is this word or phrase supposed to represent something other than what it's saying? And then once we do that, we got to figure out how those words affect the meaning and the tone of the text overall. So now that we know, what the connotation is of this word, how does that help add to the meaning of the text, or how does that help impact the tone? And then lastly, explain how these word choices relate to the context or the medium. So based on the context, based on when this poem was written, this is why this author would use these words. Right? In the activity you're going to do leading up to checkpoint 2, we're going to read a poem by Langston Hughes. All right. He uses the word Negro a lot in the poem to describe the black musician that the poem is talking about. The reason being is because at that time in the 1920s in Harlem, that was the accepted term, for black people. Now we say somebody's African American or black. Back then, they would have said he's a Negro because there was still a lot of, we're still only shortly removed from slavery. So there's not as many words and phrases we have as we have today. So you might read that poem and think, well, nobody says Negro anymore. But at that time, that was the accepted and appropriate term. So that's where the context comes into play. Is he's choosing that word because that was the appropriate word to use at that time. Had he written the poem today, he might have used a different word. All right. So that's how we go about, analyzing word choice. We're going to do some practice with that in checkpoint 2 and an activity with that Langston Hughes poem leading up to the checkpoint. But just as a key reminder, these are our important phrases to take away. We have 3 types of meanings: denotative, connotative, and figurative. Denotating, since you denote something, you write it down, is the dictionary or written down definition of a word. Connotating is the emotional or cultural association given to the word. And then our figurative meaning is when that word or phrase represents something other than what it literally says. It's raining cats and dogs. I slept like a rock. Things like that. The impact or effect is the consequence these words have. For example, the way it makes a reader feel, or the way it adds to the meaning of a text, how it adds to a theme or a symbol or something like that. The meaning of the text is the idea beneath the surface, like those symbols or those metaphors or the message the author wants us to get across. All right. The tone is the attitude of the author or speaker shown through the choice of their words. So the word choice can affect the tone of the text. And again, think of tone as if this poem or this text were to come to life, how would it be as a person? What would its attitude be? That's the tone of a text. And the context is the setting where something takes place, especially historically, right? So what was going on in history at the time this was written? That's the context of a poem, which has a lot to do with the words they choose, because we would have used certain words in 1920 that aren't the same words we'll use today in 2020. Okay. And the medium is the form used to communicate something. We might use certain words when we write a blog post that we wouldn't use when we write a newspaper article. Or when you text, you type a certain way. You abbreviate a lot of words. When you write an essay, it has to be a little bit more formal. So that's how word choice comes into play in there. Okay. So my friends, that is the deal with word choice. I hope this helps. And if you have any questions, don't be afraid to reach out. Please remember that stuff for progress reports is due this weekend. So I hope you can use this to help you get that stuff done. And I will see you guys all next week in class. Thank you, guys. Ba-da-ba-bum.